The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 3B as Margaret Whitmore smoothed her simple navy dress and took her seat at the defendant's table. Across the polished wood divide, her husband of 15 years adjusted his Italian silk tie and whispered something to the striking brunette beside him that made her laugh loudly enough for the entire courtroom to hear. Vanessa Caldwell wore a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the light with every gesture, a bracelet Margaret recognized as one Richard had claimed was a business expense just 3 months ago. Before we dive deeper into this story of justice and hidden truths, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Are you tuning in from a bustling city, a quiet suburb, or maybe somewhere completely different? Drop a comment and let me know what part of the world you're joining us from as we witness Margaret's incredible journey unfold. Richard Chun straightened his shoulders and nodded confidently toward his legal team, a trio of sharp-suited attorneys from the prestigious firm of Morrison, Blake & Associates. Lead counsel Patricia Morrison had built her reputation on high-stakes divorce cases, particularly those involving wealthy businessmen who needed to protect their assets from vindictive ex-wives. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun that matched her cold smile as she organized thick files across the mahogany table. Margaret's attorney, Thomas Fletcher, appeared almost apologetic as he pulled a single worn briefcase from beneath his chair. The contrast was striking and intentional. Fletcher wore a department store suit that had seen better days, his hair slightly unkempt as if he had rushed to court that morning. Several courtroom observers exchanged knowing glances, already predicting the outcome of what seemed like a severely mismatched legal battle. Judge Harrison Blackwood called the proceedings to order with a sharp rap of his gavel. The distinguished jurist had presided over countless divorce cases in his 20-year career, but even he seemed surprised by the apparent disparity between the two legal representations. Morrison rose gracefully, her confidence filling the room like expensive perfume. Morrison began her opening statement with practiced precision. She painted Richard as a self-made entrepreneur who had built a thriving import business through years of tireless work and strategic investments. Margaret, according to Morrison's narrative, had contributed nothing more than basic household management during their marriage. She had no independent income, no business experience, and no legitimate claim to the substantial assets Richard had accumulated through his own efforts and intelligence. The attorney's voice carried a tone of barely concealed disdain as she described Margaret's supposed attempts to claim half of everything Richard had earned. Morrison gestured toward financial documents that allegedly proved Margaret had been completely dependent on her husband's generosity throughout their marriage. She had never worked outside the home, never contributed to business decisions, and never demonstrated any understanding of the complex financial world that Richard navigated daily. Vanessa shifted in her seat, unable to suppress a satisfied smirk as Morrison detailed the prenuptial agreement Margaret had signed before their wedding. The document clearly stated that in the event of divorce, each party would retain only the assets they had brought into the marriage plus any gifts explicitly given by the other spouse. Morrison emphasized that Margaret had brought virtually nothing to the union except student loan debt and a modest savings account. Richard leaned back in his chair, projecting an aura of complete control over the situation. He had planned this divorce meticulously, timing it perfectly to coincide with what appeared to be his peak earning potential. His business had just secured several major international contracts, and his investment portfolio had reached unprecedented heights. Everything had been structured to minimize Margaret's potential claims while maximizing his own financial position. Fletcher's opening response seemed hesitant and unprepared by comparison. He spoke softly about Margaret's contributions as a wife and partner, mentioning her support during Richard's early business struggles and her management of their household affairs. His arguments felt weak and outdated, focusing on emotional rather than legal grounds for asset division. Several spectators shook their heads sympathetically, already feeling sorry for Margaret's seemingly hopeless situation. The first witness Morrison called was Richard's financial advisor, Stephen Walsh, who had worked closely with Richard for over a decade. Walsh testified about Richard's business acumen and his ability to identify profitable opportunities in emerging markets. He described Richard as a visionary entrepreneur whose success stemmed from his willingness to take calculated risks and his deep understanding of international trade regulations. Walsh's testimony painted Margaret as someone who had never shown interest in Richard's business affairs. She rarely attended business dinners, never asked questions about investment strategies, and seemed content to leave all financial decisions to her husband. According to Walsh, Margaret appeared to view Richard's work as something that simply provided the lifestyle she enjoyed without requiring any effort or understanding on her part. Vanessa nodded approvingly at every point Walsh made, occasionally whispering loud enough for others to hear her agreement with his assessment. She had already begun making plans for redecorating the family home once the divorce was finalized and Richard gained full ownership. The house would need significant updates to reflect her more sophisticated taste, particularly the outdated kitchen and master bedroom that still bore traces of Margaret's conservative style. Margaret sat quietly throughout the morning session, her hands folded in her lap as witness after witness testified about her supposed ignorance of financial matters. Her expression remained calm and attentive, but she showed no signs of distress or anger despite the increasingly harsh characterizations of her role in the marriage. This unusual composure began to puzzle some observers, who expected to see tears or at least visible frustration from someone being so thoroughly humiliated in public. Fletcher asked few questions during cross-examination, often accepting the witness's statements without significant challenge. His approach seemed almost deferent, as if he was already resigned to an unfavorable outcome for his client. Morrison watched his performance with barely concealed satisfaction, confident that her team's superior preparation and resources would deliver the decisive victory Richard expected. During the lunch recess, Richard and Vanessa were overheard discussing their immediate plans for after the divorce proceedings concluded. Richard had already made arrangements for a private ceremony in the Bahamas, followed by an extended honeymoon in Europe. He spoke confidently about showing Vanessa the international business connections he had cultivated, introducing her as his new wife to partners who had never fully respected Margaret's place in his life. The afternoon session continued with testimony from Richard's business associates, each one reinforcing the narrative of his singular responsibility for their shared prosperity. They described Margaret as a pleasant but unremarkable woman who rarely engaged in substantive conversations about business or investments. One partner mentioned that Margaret often seemed more interested in charity work and community activities than in understanding the source of the wealth that made such pursuits possible. As the day drew to a close, Margaret's demeanor remained unchanged despite hours of testimony designed to diminish her contributions and intelligence. Fletcher gathered his modest materials with the same apologetic efficiency he had displayed throughout the proceedings, while Morrison's team organized their extensive documentation with obvious satisfaction. Judge Blackwood scheduled the next session for the following week, allowing both sides time to prepare additional evidence and witness testimony. As the courtroom emptied, Richard placed his arm around Vanessa's waist and guided her toward the exit, speaking loudly enough for Margaret to hear about dinner reservations at the city's most exclusive restaurant. His confidence seemed absolute, his victory assured by the overwhelming evidence of Margaret's apparent irrelevance to their shared financial success. The following Monday arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to mirror the atmosphere inside courtroom 3B. Richard Chun entered with even greater swagger than before, his confidence bolstered by the previous week's proceedings and the weekend he had spent celebrating his anticipated victory with Vanessa. She accompanied him again, this time wearing a stunning emerald necklace that several observers recognized as a piece from the exclusive Cartier collection. The message was clear. Richard was already spending money as if the divorce settlement was a foregone conclusion. Patricia Morrison wasted no time launching into her aggressive financial offensive. She presented detailed asset valuations that painted Richard as a man of substantial wealth who deserved to retain every penny he had earned through his superior business acumen. The family home, valued at $2.8 million, represented just the beginning of Richard's impressive portfolio. Morrison methodically outlined his ownership of 3 rental properties, a thriving import business with international connections, and investment accounts that had grown exponentially during his marriage to Margaret. Morrison's presentation included enlarged charts and graphs that dominated the courtroom's attention. Each visual aid reinforced the narrative that Richard had been the sole architect of their financial success. His business, Chun International Trading, had started with a modest $50,000 investment and now generated over $2 million in annual revenue. The attorney emphasized that this growth had occurred despite Margaret's complete lack of involvement in any business decisions or strategic planning. Stephen Walsh returned to the witness stand to provide more detailed testimony about Richard's investment philosophy and risk management strategies. He described Richard as someone who possessed an almost supernatural ability to identify emerging market opportunities before his competitors recognized their potential. Walsh testified that Richard's success in importing specialty electronics from Southeast Asia had required extensive travel, complex negotiations with foreign suppliers, and a deep understanding of international currency fluctuations that few entrepreneurs could master. Margaret's apparent irrelevance to these achievements became a central theme as Walsh described her absence from all business-related activities. She had never accompanied Richard on his international trips, claiming she preferred to stay home rather than deal with the complexities of foreign travel. She had never attended trade shows or industry conferences, showing no curiosity about the source of their increasingly comfortable lifestyle. According to Walsh, Margaret seemed content to enjoy the benefits of Richard's success without making any effort to understand or contribute to the work that made their prosperity possible. Vanessa nodded approvingly at every detail Walsh provided, occasionally leaning forward in her seat to catch every word of testimony that diminished Margaret's role in the marriage. She had already begun making extensive plans for the family home once it became Richard's sole property. The outdated kitchen would be completely renovated with professional-grade appliances and custom cabinetry that reflected her more sophisticated culinary interests. The master bedroom suite would be redesigned to accommodate her extensive wardrobe and jewelry collection, which had grown considerably since she began her relationship with Richard. Morrison called Richard's accountant, David Brennan, to testify about the couple's financial arrangements throughout their marriage. Brennan explained that Margaret had never shown interest in reviewing tax returns, investment statements, or business financial reports. She had been content to receive a monthly allowance for household expenses and personal spending, treating Richard's income as an endless resource that required no oversight or understanding on her part. Brennan described Margaret as someone who lived in a financial bubble, completely insulated from the realities of earning and managing substantial wealth. The accountant's testimony revealed that Margaret had never held a significant job during their marriage, choosing instead to focus on volunteer work and social activities that generated no income. Her involvement with local charities and community organizations, while admirable from a social perspective, had contributed nothing to their household's financial stability. Brennan emphasized that Richard had shouldered the entire burden of supporting their lifestyle, while Margaret pursued interests that were essentially expensive hobbies funded entirely by his business success. Thomas Fletcher's cross-examination of Brennan seemed perfunctory and ineffective, focusing on minor details rather than challenging the fundamental narrative being constructed by Morrison's team. Fletcher asked few substantive questions about the financial arrangements, appearing to accept Brennan's characterization of Margaret's role without significant dispute. His approach puzzled several courtroom observers who expected more aggressive advocacy for his client's interests. Morrison's next witness was Rebecca Torres, Richard's business partner in several international ventures. Torres testified about Richard's crucial role in establishing partnerships with suppliers in Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia that had become the foundation of their import business. She described Richard as a natural negotiator who understood cultural nuances that made the difference between successful and failed business relationships. Torres emphasized that these skills could not be learned from books or courses. They required innate intelligence and years of hands-on experience that Richard had developed entirely through his own efforts. Torres's testimony included detailed descriptions of the risks Richard had taken to build their business empire. He had personally guaranteed loans that could have destroyed their family's financial security if his business ventures had failed. He had invested his own money in inventory shipments that might have been lost to currency fluctuations, shipping delays, or quality control problems. According to Torres, Richard had demonstrated remarkable courage and business instinct, while Margaret remained safely insulated from any real financial risk or responsibility. The afternoon session focused on Richard's investment portfolio, which Morrison presented as evidence of his sophisticated understanding of financial markets. Richard had successfully diversified his holdings across domestic and international stocks, real estate investments, and commodity futures that had generated impressive returns over the past decade. Morrison emphasized that these investment decisions had required extensive research and market analysis that Margaret had never shown any interest in understanding or participating in. Vanessa could barely contain her excitement as Morrison detailed the value of Richard's various investment accounts. She had already begun researching luxury vacation properties in Europe and the Caribbean that would be perfect for their future together. The prospect of traveling internationally as Richard's wife, with access to his extensive business network and financial resources, represented everything she had dreamed of achieving through their relationship. Margaret's behavior throughout the proceedings continued to puzzle observers who expected more emotional reaction to the systematic destruction of her claims. She took careful notes during testimony, occasionally whispering brief comments to Fletcher that he received with nods of apparent understanding. Her calm demeanor seemed almost inappropriate given the devastating picture being painted of her worthlessness and irrelevance to the marriage's financial success. Fletcher's overall strategy remained unclear as he failed to present any meaningful challenges to Morrison's aggressive narrative. His questions were gentle and often seemed designed to elicit additional favorable testimony for Richard rather than protecting Margaret's interests. Several spectators began to whisper among themselves about Fletcher's competence and whether Margaret would have been better served by different legal representation. The day's final witness was Richard's primary banker, Michael Davidson, who testified about Richard's excellent credit rating and his bank's confidence in his business judgment. Davidson described Richard as one of their most valued commercial clients, someone who had consistently exceeded loan repayment schedules and had never required any assistance managing his complex financial obligations. The banker emphasized that Richard's success had been built on his personal reputation and business relationships, assets that could not be divided or shared with anyone else. Davidson's testimony included references to Margaret's minimal involvement in banking matters throughout their marriage. She had rarely visited the bank for any reason other than routine personal transactions, showing no interest in the commercial accounts or business loans that funded their lifestyle. According to Davidson, Margaret seemed to view banking as Richard's responsibility, another aspect of adult life that she preferred to avoid understanding or managing personally. As the court session concluded, Morrison announced her intention to present additional evidence during the following week's proceedings that would further demonstrate Richard's sole ownership of their marital assets. She hinted at documentation that would prove Margaret's complete dependence on Richard's generosity and her lack of any legitimate claim to property or investments she had never earned or contributed to acquiring. Richard and Vanessa left the courthouse arm in arm, their conversation loud enough for departing spectators to overhear their immediate plans for celebrating another successful day in court. They discussed dinner reservations at the city's most exclusive steakhouse, followed by a private showing of luxury condominiums that Vanessa was considering for their post-divorce residence. Richard's confidence seemed to grow with each passing hour, his victory appearing more certain and complete than he had originally dared to hope. Margaret gathered her modest materials with the same quiet efficiency she had displayed throughout the proceedings, her expression remaining mysteriously calm despite the overwhelming assault on her character and contributions. Fletcher's goodbye seemed almost apologetic, as if he was already preparing her for an unfavorable outcome that appeared increasingly inevitable. Yet something in Margaret's demeanor suggested a level of preparation and confidence that seemed inconsistent with the apparent hopelessness of her legal position. The third week of proceedings began with an unexpected shift in courtroom dynamics that no one could have anticipated. Patricia Morrison arrived with her usual confidence, but something in her demeanor suggested she had encountered complications during her weekend preparation. Her typically immaculate legal files appeared more disorganized than usual, and she spent several minutes shuffling through documents before the session began. Richard noticed her unusual behavior and leaned forward to whisper questions that Morrison deflected with forced smiles and vague reassurances. Thomas Fletcher entered the courtroom with a subtle transformation in his appearance and bearing. While he still wore his modest department store suit, his posture seemed more assured, and he carried himself with an air of quiet confidence that had been absent during the previous weeks. Margaret accompanied him with the same serene composure she had maintained throughout the proceedings, but observers noticed she had begun taking more detailed notes and occasionally pointing out specific passages in documents that Fletcher reviewed with obvious interest. Judge Blackwood called the session to order, and Morrison rose to continue her presentation of Richard's financial empire. However, her opening statements lacked the commanding authority she had displayed in previous sessions. She began discussing the prenuptial agreement that had seemed so favorable to Richard's position, but her explanation became hesitant when she reached certain clauses that had apparently raised unexpected concerns during her weekend review. The prenuptial agreement, originally drafted 15 years earlier, contained language that Morrison now described as unusually complex for a standard marital contract. Specific provisions regarding offshore holdings and international assets had been included at Margaret's insistence, according to the document's history, but Morrison admitted that Richard's legal team at the time had not fully explored the implications of these clauses. The original attorneys had apparently assumed these provisions were merely theoretical, never expecting them to become relevant during potential divorce proceedings. Fletcher stood to address the court for the first time with genuine authority in his voice. He began asking pointed questions about Richard's compliance with the prenuptial agreement's disclosure requirements, particularly regarding any financial holdings outside the United States. His questions were precise and legally sophisticated, revealing a depth of knowledge about international financial law that surprised everyone in the courtroom, including Morrison and Richard. Richard's expression began to show the first signs of genuine concern as Fletcher continued his methodical questioning about offshore accounts and foreign business partnerships. The prenuptial agreement required complete disclosure of all assets, both domestic and international, but Fletcher suggested that Richard might have failed to meet these obligations. His questions implied that undisclosed foreign holdings could potentially void certain provisions of the prenuptial agreement that Morrison had been counting on to protect Richard's assets. Morrison objected repeatedly to Fletcher's line of questioning, arguing that he was fishing for information without any evidence of wrongdoing. However, Judge Blackwood overruled most of her objections, noting that the prenuptial agreement's disclosure requirements were central to determining its enforceability. The judge's interest in Fletcher's questions seemed to grow with each exchange, and his previously dismissive attitude toward Margaret's legal representation began to shift toward respectful attention. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in her seat as the discussion turned to financial matters she had never heard Richard mention during their relationship. She had assumed his wealth was entirely domestic and transparent, never imagining that international complications might threaten her access to the lifestyle she had been promised. Her confident smirk began to fade as she realized that the proceedings might not unfold exactly as Richard had assured her they would. Fletcher requested permission to present evidence regarding offshore banking relationships that Richard had established during the marriage. He produced a series of documents that caused Morrison to request an immediate sidebar conference with Judge Blackwood. The hushed conversation lasted several minutes, with Morrison's animated gestures suggesting she was encountering information that threatened her carefully constructed legal strategy. When the sidebar concluded, Judge Blackwood announced that the court would require complete financial discovery from both parties, including any and all foreign accounts or business relationships established during the marriage. Morrison's face appeared pale as she returned to her table, and she immediately began whispering urgently with Richard about implications that seemed to have blindsided their entire legal team. Richard's confidence suffered its first significant blow as he realized that Fletcher's questions were not random fishing expeditions, but targeted inquiries based on specific knowledge. The comfortable assumption that Margaret had been completely ignorant of his financial activities began to crumble as Fletcher demonstrated familiarity with banking regulations and international disclosure requirements that suggested extensive preparation and research. Fletcher's next series of questions focused on Richard's business partnerships in Southeast Asia, particularly regarding the ownership structure of Chun International Trading. He asked whether Richard had established any subsidiary companies or joint ventures that might not have been included in previous financial disclosures. His questions revealed detailed knowledge of Richard's business operations that seemed impossible for someone who had supposedly been denied access to relevant financial information. Morrison attempted to object to Fletcher's increasingly aggressive questioning, arguing that he was exceeding the scope of the prenuptial agreement review. However, Fletcher calmly cited specific legal precedents regarding disclosure requirements in international asset cases, demonstrating a command of complex financial law that contradicted his previous appearance of inexperience and inadequate preparation. The afternoon session took a dramatic turn when Fletcher requested permission to call Margaret as a witness. Morrison immediately objected, arguing that spousal privilege protected certain communications, but Judge Blackwood ruled that Margaret could testify about her own knowledge and involvement in financial matters. Margaret rose from her seat with quiet dignity, her first active participation in the proceedings after weeks of silent observation. Margaret's testimony began with her educational background, which Fletcher revealed included a master's degree in international business from Georgetown University and several years of experience working for a multinational consulting firm before her marriage to Richard. This information came as a complete shock to Richard and Vanessa, who had apparently never been told about Margaret's professional qualifications and work history prior to their relationship. Fletcher guided Margaret through a detailed explanation of her understanding of international business law and offshore banking regulations. Her responses were articulate and sophisticated, revealing extensive knowledge of precisely the financial areas that Morrison had claimed she was too ignorant to understand. Margaret's calm, professional demeanor contrasted sharply with the helpless housewife image that Richard's legal team had been promoting throughout the proceedings. Margaret testified that she had insisted on the prenuptial agreement's complex international provisions because of her professional background and her concerns about potential compliance issues with foreign banking regulations. She had specifically requested language that would protect both parties from potential legal problems related to undisclosed offshore accounts or unreported foreign income. Her testimony suggested that she had been far more involved in the financial planning of their marriage than anyone had previously understood. The revelation of Margaret's professional background sent shockwaves through the courtroom and left Richard visibly stunned. Vanessa appeared confused and angry, apparently realizing that Richard had either lied to her about Margaret's capabilities or had somehow forgotten crucial information about his own wife's qualifications and experience. The comfortable narrative of Margaret's dependence and ignorance began to collapse as she demonstrated knowledge and competence that exceeded even Richard's understanding of international financial law. Fletcher's questioning revealed that Margaret had maintained her professional licenses and continuing education requirements throughout her marriage, despite not working outside the home. She had spent her time during Richard's business travels conducting research and analysis that had informed many of his most successful investment decisions, though he had apparently never acknowledged or understood the source of the strategic insights he had claimed as his own. Margaret's testimony included specific examples of international opportunities she had identified and recommended to Richard, investments that had become some of his most profitable ventures. Her analysis of Southeast Asian markets and currency trends had guided his expansion into those regions, though Richard had apparently convinced himself that these insights had come from his own business instinct rather than his wife's professional research and recommendations. Morrison's cross-examination of Margaret proved ineffective and potentially damaging to Richard's case. Margaret's responses to challenging questions were measured and professional, revealing a depth of knowledge about international business that Morrison was unprepared to challenge. Margaret's calm confidence under aggressive questioning demonstrated precisely the kind of professional competence that contradicted everything Morrison had argued about her client's supposed ignorance and dependence. As the session concluded, Judge Blackwood ordered both parties to provide complete documentation of all financial holdings, domestic and international, within 10 days. The order specifically mentioned offshore accounts, foreign business partnerships, and any international investments established during the marriage. Morrison's expression suggested that this discovery process might reveal information that would seriously complicate Richard's previously secure legal position. Richard left the courthouse in obvious distress, his previous swagger replaced by nervous energy as he realized that his divorce proceedings had taken an unexpected and potentially catastrophic turn. Vanessa walked beside him in confused silence, apparently struggling to process the dramatic revelations about Margaret's true capabilities and the implications for their future plans together. Margaret departed with Fletcher, their quiet conversation suggesting ongoing legal strategy rather than the desperate damage control that characterized Richard's departure. Her transformation from silent victim to competent professional had shifted the entire dynamic of the proceedings, leaving observers to wonder what other surprises might emerge as the case continued to unfold. The fourth week of proceedings arrived with an atmosphere of anticipation that filled courtroom 3B like electricity before a thunderstorm. Richard entered with visible tension, replacing his former confidence, his expensive suit unable to mask the anxiety that had consumed him since Judge Blackwood's discovery order. Vanessa accompanied him but kept greater distance than usual, her previous displays of affection replaced by wary observation as she began to question everything Richard had told her about his financial situation and his marriage to Margaret. Patricia Morrison arrived with 3 additional associates and several boxes of documents that suggested her weekend had been spent in frantic preparation for revelations she had never anticipated. Her usual commanding presence seemed diminished by the weight of information she had been forced to uncover during the court-ordered financial discovery process. Morrison's opening statements were noticeably shorter and more cautious than her previous presentations, reflecting her growing awareness that Richard's case was far more complicated than anyone had initially understood. Thomas Fletcher entered the courtroom with a complete transformation in his professional demeanor that left observers wondering if they were seeing the same attorney who had appeared so ineffective during the first weeks of proceedings. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had been holding powerful cards while allowing his opponents to overplay their hand. Margaret accompanied him with the same serene composure, but now her calm seemed like the quiet assurance of someone who had been patiently waiting for the right moment to reveal devastating information. Judge Blackwood called the session to order and immediately requested that both parties present their complete financial discovery materials. Fletcher stood first, a dramatic reversal of the previous pattern where Morrison had dominated the proceedings. He announced that his client was prepared to provide full disclosure of all assets, both domestic and international, that had been acquired during the marriage and would reveal information that fundamentally changed everyone's understanding of the couple's financial relationship. Fletcher began by presenting documentation from Credit Suisse that showed the existence of multiple offshore accounts established in Margaret's name during the early years of her marriage to Richard. The accounts contained substantial balances that had grown significantly over the 15-year period, reaching totals that exceeded many of Richard's domestic holdings. The revelation that Margaret possessed independent wealth contradicted everything Morrison had argued about her complete financial dependence on Richard's business success. Richard's face drained of all color as Fletcher continued presenting evidence that Margaret's offshore accounts had been funded through transfers from a family trust established by her late grandfather, Harrison Whitmore. The Whitmore family trust had been created decades earlier and contained assets worth over $50 million, making Margaret the beneficiary of generational wealth that dwarfed Richard's business earnings. The irony was devastating. While Richard had been congratulating himself on his financial success, he had been married to someone whose family fortune exceeded his achievements by an order of magnitude. Morrison objected frantically to the introduction of trust documents, arguing that premarital family wealth was irrelevant to the division of marital assets. However, Fletcher calmly explained that the trust had been actively managed during the marriage and that Margaret had used trust income to make substantial contributions to Richard's business ventures without his knowledge or understanding of the source. The revelation that Margaret had been secretly funding aspects of Richard's success, while he claimed sole credit, represented a complete inversion of their established narrative. Fletcher called his first witness, Jonathan Whitmore, Margaret's cousin and trustee of the Whitmore Family Trust. Jonathan's appearance immediately commanded respect in the courtroom. His impeccably tailored suit, distinguished bearing, and obvious wealth made Richard's previous displays of affluence seem almost quaint by comparison. Jonathan's testimony revealed that Margaret had specifically requested that her family wealth remain private during her marriage to protect Richard's pride and to allow their relationship to develop without the complications that often accompany significant financial disparities. Jonathan's testimony included detailed documentation showing that Margaret had quietly used trust income to purchase the family home, fund Richard's initial business investments, and provide capital for his international expansion. The documents revealed that nearly 60% of Richard's alleged personal wealth had actually originated from Margaret's family trust, though the transactions had been structured to allow Richard to believe he was the sole source of their prosperity. Margaret's generosity and discretion had enabled Richard to maintain his self-image as a successful entrepreneur while actually benefiting from her family's financial support. Vanessa appeared stunned and increasingly angry as Jonathan's testimony revealed the true source of the wealth she had been so eager to share. The luxury lifestyle she had enjoyed with Richard, including the expensive jewelry and exclusive restaurants, had been funded primarily by Margaret's family money rather than Richard's business acumen. The realization that she had been mocking and dismissing the very person whose generosity had made her comfortable lifestyle possible left her visibly shaken and embarrassed. Fletcher's next witness was Dr. Patricia Hammond, Margaret's former supervisor at the international consulting firm where Margaret had worked before her marriage. Dr. Hammond's testimony revealed that Margaret had been one of their most promising analysts, specializing in Southeast Asian markets and international investment strategies. She had voluntarily left the firm after her marriage, but had continued providing consulting services on a freelance basis, generating substantial income that she had quietly contributed to the family's financial success. Dr. Hammond testified that Margaret had been the anonymous author of several influential market analysis reports that had guided Richard's most successful business ventures. The strategic insights that Richard had credited to his own business instinct had actually originated from Margaret's professional research and analysis, which she had shared with him as informal dinner conversation without revealing the extensive work behind her recommendations. Margaret's decision to support her husband's career from behind the scenes had enabled his success while protecting his ego and self-confidence. The revelation that Margaret had been the intellectual architect of Richard's business strategy while allowing him to take complete credit represented a level of generosity and selflessness that left courtroom observers amazed. Fletcher presented email correspondence between Margaret and various business contacts that showed her extensive involvement in research, analysis, and strategic planning that had directly contributed to Richard's most profitable investments and business relationships. Fletcher then called Margaret's private banker from Credit Suisse, Klaus Weber, who had flown in from Switzerland specifically to testify about the offshore accounts. Weber's testimony revealed that Margaret had maintained complete control over her family trust assets throughout her marriage and had never given Richard access to or knowledge of her true financial position. The accounts had grown substantially during the marriage through careful investment management that Margaret had directed personally, demonstrating financial sophistication that contradicted every assumption Morrison had made about her capabilities. Weber's testimony included documentation showing that Margaret had established several charitable foundations using trust income, contributing millions of dollars to educational and humanitarian causes without ever seeking public recognition or credit for her philanthropy. Her quiet generosity had supported numerous organizations and scholarships that had improved countless lives while her husband remained completely unaware of her charitable activities and their substantial financial impact. Morrison's attempts to cross-examine Weber proved disastrous for Richard's case. Weber's responses revealed that Margaret had specifically structured her financial arrangements to comply with all international tax and disclosure requirements, demonstrating a level of legal and financial knowledge that exceeded most professional advisors. Her careful attention to regulatory compliance contrasted sharply with Richard's apparent ignorance of similar requirements for his own business operations. Fletcher's final revelation came when he announced that Thomas Fletcher was not actually his real name or his complete professional identity. He introduced himself as Thomas Fletcher Hamilton, senior partner at Hamilton, Rothschild & Associates, one of the most prestigious international law firms in the world. His initial appearance as an inexperienced local attorney had been a deliberate strategy designed to allow Morrison's team to underestimate their opposition while Margaret gathered evidence of Richard's actual financial situation and legal vulnerabilities. The transformation of Margaret's legal representation from apparently incompetent to world-class expertise sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Hamilton's firm specialized in complex international financial cases involving ultra-high-net-worth individuals, and his presence indicated that Margaret's case involved legal and financial complexities that no one had previously understood. Morrison's confident assumption that she was facing inferior opposition had led her to make strategic mistakes that had now exposed Richard to potentially devastating legal consequences. Hamilton presented evidence that Richard had violated multiple provisions of the prenuptial agreement through his failure to disclose offshore business relationships and foreign investment activities. The agreement's penalty clauses for non-disclosure were severe and could potentially result in Richard forfeiting claims to assets he had assumed were entirely his own. Margaret's insistence on comprehensive disclosure requirements 15 years earlier had created legal protections that now threatened to strip Richard of most of his business empire. Judge Blackwood called a recess to review the extensive documentation that had been presented, but his expression suggested that the proceedings had taken a turn that would fundamentally alter the expected outcome. Richard sat in stunned silence as the full scope of his miscalculations became clear, while Vanessa stared at him with growing anger and disbelief. The comfortable assumptions that had guided their relationship and their expectations for the divorce settlement had been completely shattered by revelations that neither of them had seen coming. Margaret rose from her seat with quiet dignity, her transformation from apparent victim to sophisticated heiress complete. Hamilton gathered his materials with professional efficiency, his strategy having successfully exposed the true financial and legal dynamics of the marriage. The revelation that Margaret had been the primary source of wealth and strategic insight throughout the relationship, while Richard claimed sole credit, represented a reversal so complete that observers struggled to process the implications for the final settlement. As the recess began, Richard and Morrison huddled in urgent conversation about damage control options that appeared increasingly limited. Vanessa stood apart from them, apparently realizing that everything she had believed about Richard's wealth and prospects had been based on lies and self-deception. Margaret departed with Hamilton, their quiet confidence suggesting that the most devastating revelations were yet to come as the case moved toward its conclusion. The final session began with Judge Blackwood entering the courtroom carrying a thick folder of legal precedents and financial documentation that he had clearly spent considerable time reviewing during the extended recess. His expression was grave and thoughtful, suggesting that the revelations from the previous session had required extensive legal research to determine appropriate remedies. The atmosphere in courtroom 3B felt heavy with anticipation, as everyone understood that the day would bring definitive resolution to a case that had taken unprecedented turns. Richard entered the courtroom looking haggard and defeated, his expensive suits now seeming like costumes that no longer fit his reduced circumstances. Patricia Morrison accompanied him with the weary resignation of an attorney who had realized that her client's case had become legally indefensible. Morrison's team of associates appeared subdued and professional, but their body language suggested they were preparing for damage control rather than victory. The confident aggression that had characterized their early presentations had been replaced by defensive positioning as they awaited Judge Blackwood's rulings on the devastating evidence Hamilton had presented. Vanessa entered separately from Richard for the first time since the proceedings began, her previous displays of possessive affection replaced by cool distance that spoke volumes about her reassessment of their relationship. She had spent the intervening days processing the reality that everything she had believed about Richard's wealth and status had been based on deception and self-delusion. The expensive jewelry Richard had given her now felt like evidence of his fraud rather than symbols of his success, and her future plans required complete reconsideration based on the truth about their financial situation. Thomas Fletcher Hamilton entered with Margaret, both carrying themselves with the quiet confidence of legal professionals who had successfully executed a complex strategy. Hamilton's transformation from apparently incompetent local counsel to internationally recognized expert had been so complete that observers still struggled to reconcile his current authority with his previous performance. Margaret's serene composure had evolved into obvious satisfaction as she prepared to witness the complete vindication of her patient and carefully planned approach to exposing Richard's true character and legal vulnerabilities. Judge Blackwood began by acknowledging that the case had presented unusual legal complexities that required careful consideration of international financial law, trust administration, and prenuptial agreement enforcement. His preliminary remarks suggested that the court had identified multiple violations of both the original prenuptial agreement and various federal disclosure requirements that would significantly impact the final settlement. The judge's tone was measured but firm, indicating that he intended to deliver comprehensive rulings that would address all aspects of the case. The judge's first ruling addressed the validity and enforceability of the prenuptial agreement that Morrison had relied upon to protect Richard's assets. Judge Blackwood determined that Richard's failure to disclose offshore business relationships and foreign investment activities constituted material breaches of the agreement's disclosure requirements. These violations were sufficiently serious to trigger penalty clauses that Margaret had insisted upon during the original negotiations, clauses that Richard's attorneys had apparently dismissed as unlikely to ever become relevant. Judge Blackwood's analysis of the penalty provisions was devastating for Richard's legal position. The prenuptial agreement specified that material non-disclosure would result in the violating party forfeiting claims to assets that had been acquired through undisclosed financial activities. Since Hamilton had demonstrated that Richard's most successful business ventures had been funded through Margaret's family trust and guided by her professional analysis, Richard faced losing control of the very business empire he had claimed as evidence of his superior capabilities. The court's ruling on asset division represented a complete reversal of everything Morrison had argued throughout the proceedings. Margaret was awarded full ownership of the family home, which had been purchased primarily with her trust income despite being titled in Richard's name. She also received controlling interest in Chun International Trading, based on documentation showing that her family trust had provided the majority of the capital that enabled the business's growth and international expansion. Richard's claimed business acumen was revealed to have been entirely dependent on resources and insights that Margaret had provided while allowing him to take complete credit. Judge Blackwood's ruling on spousal support provided another shocking reversal that left the courtroom stunned. Instead of Margaret receiving support from Richard as Morrison had feared, Richard was ordered to pay substantial support to Margaret based on her contribution to his business success and her sacrifice of independent career opportunities to support his ventures. The amount was calculated based on the income Margaret had foregone by providing unpaid consulting services to Richard's business rather than pursuing her own professional career in international finance. The judge's analysis of Richard's tax compliance revealed additional legal problems that extended far beyond the divorce proceedings. Hamilton had uncovered evidence that Richard had failed to properly report income from foreign business activities, creating potential criminal liability for tax evasion and money laundering. Judge Blackwood announced his intention to refer these matters to federal prosecutors for investigation, effectively destroying Richard's professional reputation and business prospects regardless of the divorce outcome. Richard's business licenses and professional certifications faced immediate suspension pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. His import business could not legally continue operating without proper licensing, and his international suppliers would likely terminate relationships with a company under federal investigation. The business empire that had been the foundation of his identity and self-worth faced complete destruction as a direct result of his own illegal activities and deceptive practices. Vanessa's reaction to these rulings was immediate and dramatic. She rose from her seat and walked directly to the courtroom exit without speaking to Richard or acknowledging his attempts to get her attention. Her departure made clear that her relationship with Richard had been entirely based on her belief in his wealth and status, both of which had been revealed as fraudulent constructions built on Margaret's hidden generosity. The expensive engagement ring Richard had given her was left on the defendant's table as she abandoned their plans for marriage and the lifestyle she had expected to share. Margaret's attorney fees, which Hamilton revealed had been substantial given his firm's international reputation and expertise, were ordered to be paid by Richard as additional penalty for the frivolous nature of his claims and his violations of the disclosure requirements. The fees alone represented more than Richard would retain from the asset division, effectively guaranteeing that he would emerge from the divorce proceedings in serious financial difficulty despite having entered them expecting to protect substantial wealth. The court's ruling on Margaret's family trust assets confirmed that Richard had never had any legitimate claim to the Whitmore family wealth, despite having unknowingly benefited from it throughout their marriage. Margaret's decision to maintain the privacy of her family fortune while supporting Richard's career had been an act of extraordinary generosity that he had repaid with arrogance, infidelity, and public humiliation. The contrast between Margaret's quiet dignity and Richard's self-promoting behavior became even more stark in light of the true financial dynamics of their relationship. Judge Blackwood's final rulings addressed the ongoing business operations and asset management that would be required to implement the court's decisions. Margaret was granted immediate control of all business accounts and operations, with Richard's access terminated to prevent any interference with the transition. His attempts to contact international suppliers or business partners were prohibited, and his use of company credit cards and accounts was immediately suspended to protect the business assets that Margaret now controlled. The transformation of courtroom dynamics was complete as Richard sat in stunned silence, while Margaret rose to accept the court's comprehensive vindication of her position. Hamilton's strategy had not only protected Margaret's interests, but had exposed Richard's illegal activities and deceptive practices in ways that would have lasting consequences beyond the divorce proceedings. Richard's reputation in both professional and social circles would never recover from the revelations about his dependence on Margaret's hidden support and his violations of legal disclosure requirements. Patricia Morrison's closing statements were brief and focused primarily on technical appeals procedures rather than any defense of Richard's actions or character. Her professional reputation had suffered significant damage from her aggressive pursuit of claims that had proven to be based on fundamental misunderstandings of the financial and legal facts. Morrison's future career prospects would be affected by her association with a case that had exposed her inadequate preparation and her willingness to make arguments that had no basis in reality. The courtroom observers who had initially sympathized with Richard's claims now regarded him with a mixture of disgust and amazement at the scale of his deception and self-delusion. Margaret's patient endurance of weeks of public humiliation while knowing the truth about their financial relationship demonstrated a level of character and strategic thinking that commanded universal respect. Her quiet victory represented not just personal vindication, but a moral lesson about the dangers of arrogance and the ultimate triumph of truth over deception. As the final session concluded, Richard faced the reality of leaving the courthouse with virtually nothing remaining of the wealth and status he had claimed as his own achievements. Margaret departed with Hamilton, their professional relationship having delivered complete success in exposing Richard's fraud and protecting her family's assets. The case would become a landmark precedent for prenuptial agreement enforcement and international asset disclosure, ensuring that Margaret's experience would help protect other victims of similar deception and financial abuse. 6 months after the final court ruling, the transformation in everyone's circumstances had become dramatically apparent to anyone who had followed the proceedings. Richard Chun now lived in a modest studio apartment on the outskirts of the city, his former life of luxury reduced to basic necessities as he struggled to find employment while facing ongoing federal investigation for tax evasion and money laundering. His expensive suits had been sold to pay legal fees, and his once confident demeanor had been replaced by the haunted expression of someone whose entire identity had been built on lies that had finally been exposed. The federal prosecutors had indeed pursued the criminal charges that Judge Blackwood had recommended, and Richard faced the very real possibility of prison time for his failure to properly report foreign income and his violations of banking disclosure requirements. His business licenses remained suspended indefinitely, effectively barring him from the import industry where he had claimed expertise. Former business partners distanced themselves from any association with him, and his professional reputation had been so thoroughly destroyed that finding new employment proved nearly impossible. Vanessa had disappeared from Richard's life completely within days of the final court ruling, her engagement ring abandoned and her social media presence scrubbed of any references to their relationship. She had quickly attached herself to another wealthy businessman, Though her reputation for opportunistic behavior had spread through the social circles she had hoped to penetrate. Her brief taste of luxury lifestyle had ended abruptly when the truth about Richard's financial deception became public knowledge, leaving her to start over with a damaged reputation and expensive tastes she could no longer afford. Patricia Morrison's legal career had suffered significant damage from her association with Richard's failed case. The prestigious law firm of Morrison, Blake and Associates faced professional sanctions for their inadequate preparation and their willingness to make claims in court that had no factual basis. Morrison herself was forced to take a leave of absence to address the ethical complaints that had been filed against her by the State Bar Association. Her reputation for aggressive representation had been replaced by notoriety for spectacular failure in one of the most publicized divorce cases in recent legal history. Margaret's transformation, by contrast, had been remarkable and inspiring to observe. She had returned to active management of the Whitmore Family Trust with renewed purpose and energy, her years of quiet patience replaced by decisive leadership that impressed even the most experienced financial advisors. Her decision to end her self-imposed exile from professional life had been welcomed enthusiastically by former colleagues who had never understood why someone of her capabilities had chosen domestic obscurity over career advancement. The family home had been completely renovated under Margaret's direction, its previous ostentation replaced by elegant simplicity that reflected her refined taste and genuine appreciation for quality rather than status. She had removed all traces of Richard's influence from the property, creating spaces that were both beautiful and functional for her new life as an independent woman of substantial means. The house had become a gathering place for charitable organizations and business meetings that reflected Margaret's growing influence in both philanthropic and professional circles. Margaret's management of Chun International Trading had surprised everyone with its immediate success and ethical transformation. She had restructured the business to emphasize fair trade practices and sustainable development in Southeast Asian markets, using her international business expertise to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. The company's profits had actually increased under her leadership, proving that ethical business practices could be more successful than the questionable methods Richard had employed. Thomas Fletcher Hamilton had returned to his international practice with enhanced reputation from his successful handling of Margaret's case. The strategic brilliance of his approach had become a case study in legal schools for complex international asset protection and prenuptial agreement enforcement. His firm had received numerous inquiries from other high-net-worth individuals who faced similar situations with deceptive spouses, and Hamilton had become a recognized expert in protecting family wealth from fraudulent claims. The charitable foundation that Margaret established using the recovered assets had quickly become one of the most respected philanthropic organizations in the region. Her focus on educational opportunities for women in international business had created scholarships and mentorship programs that were already changing lives and careers. Margaret's decision to use her vindication as a platform for helping others demonstrated the genuine character that had sustained her through years of unrecognized sacrifice and recent public humiliation. Former friends and social acquaintances who had dismissed Margaret during her marriage now sought her friendship and approval with embarrassing enthusiasm. Her emergence as a woman of independent wealth and sophisticated business acumen had completely altered her social standing, though Margaret was selective about which relationships she chose to rebuild. She had learned valuable lessons about the superficial nature of many social connections and preferred to invest her time in relationships based on genuine mutual respect and shared values. The legal precedent established by Margaret's case had already influenced several other high-profile divorce proceedings involving international assets and prenuptial agreements. Family court judges now routinely ordered comprehensive financial discovery that included offshore holdings and foreign business relationships, making it much more difficult for deceptive spouses to hide assets or misrepresent their financial circumstances. Margaret's patient documentation and strategic planning had created protections that would benefit countless other victims of marital financial fraud. Richard's former business associates found themselves under investigation for their own potential compliance violations as federal prosecutors expanded their inquiry into the international trading networks that Richard had established. Several partnerships and supplier relationships had been terminated when foreign companies learned about the legal problems facing Richard's organization, creating business disruption that extended far beyond his personal circumstances. The reputation for reliability and ethical practices that Margaret was building had begun attracting new international partners who appreciated her transparent and lawful approach to business operations. Margaret's professional recognition had grown rapidly as business publications featured articles about her successful transformation of Chun international trading and her innovative approaches to sustainable international commerce. Speaking invitations and board positions had begun arriving regularly, offering opportunities for Margaret to share her expertise and experience with other business leaders. Her quiet years of private research and analysis had prepared her well for public leadership roles that she now embraced with confidence and enthusiasm. The contrast between Margaret's rising influence and Richard's social exile had become a topic of widespread discussion in business and legal circles throughout the city. Her grace under pressure and her strategic patience had earned universal admiration, while his arrogance and deception had made him a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating others and overestimating oneself. The complete reversal of their circumstances served as a powerful reminder that true character and genuine capability ultimately triumph over superficial appearances and self-promoting behavior. As Margaret settled into her new life as an openly successful businesswoman and philanthropist, she occasionally reflected on the years she had spent supporting Richard's career while hiding her own capabilities. Her decision to endure his arrogance and infidelity while gathering evidence of his true character had required extraordinary patience and strategic thinking, but the complete vindication of her approach had proven that justice, though sometimes delayed, could be remarkably thorough when properly pursued. Her story had become an inspiration for anyone facing similar challenges with deceptive partners or family members. What makes this story truly powerful is how it shows us that quiet strength and patient preparation can overcome even the most arrogant opposition when the truth finally emerges. Margaret's journey from dismissed housewife to respected business leader proves that real worth isn't measured by how loudly someone promotes themselves, but by their actual character and contributions. If this story of hidden strength and ultimate justice resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever encountered someone who completely underestimated others based on appearances? Share your experiences, and let's discuss how patience and preparation can triumph over arrogance and deception.